The phone call I got from my son-in-law at 7:30 on a Sunday morning, that's where this story ends. Let me start from where it began. My name doesn't matter much for the telling of this. What matters is that I'm 63 years old, retired from the Christchurch City Council after 31 years in infrastructure planning, and I thought I'd seen enough of human nature by now to not be surprised by much. I was wrong about that. About 2 years ago, my daughter, she's 31 now, was 29 at the time, told me she was getting serious with a young man she'd been seeing for about 8 months. She brought him round for Sunday roast, and I'll be honest, my first impression was decent enough. Seemed polite. Shook my hand properly. Helped clear the table without being asked. My wife warmed to him faster than I did. Which was not unusual. She's always had a softer read on people than me. His name is Lachlan. 28 at the time, works in IT support for a firm in the CBD. Grew up in Timaru, moved to Christchurch for university. Stayed on. Average income, nothing flash, which was fine. My daughter Priya earns well enough as a practice nurse, and I've never thought much of men who measure themselves by their bank balance. What I cared about was whether he treated her right and whether he had his head on straight. The first one seemed true. The second one I was less sure about, and I should have trusted that instinct a whole lot earlier than I did. The thing about Priya is that she's always been generous to a fault. When she was 13, she gave her birthday money to a girl at school whose family was going through a rough patch. When she was at university, she'd be the one buying rounds she couldn't afford, covering flatmates who were short on rent. My wife used to say it was her best quality. I used to say it was the one most likely to get her into trouble. I don't think I was wrong. About 4 months into Lachlan being on the scene, Priya mentioned in passing that she'd lent him $400 to cover a car repair. His rego was due at the same time, she said, and it had come up at a bad time for him financially. I didn't say much. $400 between two people dating seriously isn't unusual. I filed it away and didn't dwell on it. Then about 2 months later, she mentioned she'd covered his half of a weekend trip they'd taken down to Queenstown. He'd pay her back when his next pay came through, she said. It was just timing. I said, "Has he paid back the $400 yet?" She got quiet in the way that told me the answer before she said it. "He's been a bit short," she said. "But he will." I didn't push it. She was an adult. It was her money and her relationship, and I didn't want to be the father who poisoned something good over what might have been a rough patch for a young bloke. I kept my mouth shut and watched. Over the next 6 months, I watched a pattern build that I recognized but couldn't say out loud without damaging my relationship with my daughter. Lachlan always seemed to be between things financially. There was always a reason, a bill that came at the wrong time. A freelance job that hadn't paid out yet. A problem with his flatmate that had left him short 1 month. The amounts Priya was covering got larger, not smaller. A dentist bill here. His share of a flat deposit when they moved in together. A new laptop, because his work one had died, and the firm was slow to replace it. Each individual item had a reasonable explanation. Taken together, the picture was not reasonable at all. I want to be fair to Lachlan here, because this story isn't about him being a monster. He wasn't cruel to her. He wasn't aggressive or controlling in the way people usually mean that word. In some ways, she wasn't being mistreated in any way she could point to. She was just slowly, quietly, being leaned on in a way that was starting to bend her. By the time they'd been together 18 months and had been living together for about 6 of those, my wife started to notice things I'd been watching for longer. Priya had stopped talking about a trip to Europe she'd been saving for since before she met him. She'd picked up extra Saturday shifts at the practice. She'd declined a course she'd wanted to do for her professional development, too expensive right now, she said, with a shrug that didn't suit her. My wife came to me one evening after Priya had left and said, "Something's not right there." I said, "I know." We had a quiet conversation about what we could and couldn't say, and how we could say it. Parents in their 60s learn pretty quickly that you can only push so hard before you push your children right out of being honest with you. We decided to hold, wait for the right moment. Keep the door open. The right moment came at us sideways, the way it usually does. It was a Friday evening in late August. I remember because the weather had turned properly cold and I'd been out to get wood for the fire. My phone rang and it was Priya. Before she'd said 10 words, I could tell she'd been crying. She and her friend, a woman she'd been close to since nursing school, lovely person, very sensible, had been at a dinner in town. The two of them and two other couples, a birthday celebration for one of the group. Not a fancy restaurant, just a nice one. The bill had come. Priya had tapped her card. Declined. She hadn't known. She genuinely hadn't known her account was that low. She'd covered it with her credit card. But she'd been shaking the whole way home, she said. She couldn't stop thinking about it. I said, "Come over." She came over. My wife put the kettle on. Priya sat at our kitchen table and we let her talk. And what came out over the next hour was 2 years of it. The full picture. Numbers I hadn't known. Amounts that added up to something that made my chest tight when I did the mental arithmetic. Total? Across the 18 months she'd been with Lachlan, she estimated somewhere between $14,000 and $17,000. Loans that had never been repaid. Shared costs she'd always ended up covering. Things she'd quietly absorbed because she loved him, and she didn't want conflict, and she kept believing the timing would improve. Her savings, which had been solid, she'd been careful since her early 20s, were nearly gone. I didn't say "I told you so." I want to be clear about that because it matters. That's not the kind of father I am, and it wouldn't have helped her. What I said was, "This isn't about the money, it's about what the money means." She asked me what I meant. I said, "You've been working extra Saturdays and giving up things you wanted, and not going to Europe, and none of that has changed his situation, has it? It's just changed yours." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "He says we're a team." I said, "A team moves forward together. You've been moving him forward and standing still yourself." She cried again. My wife sat with her while I went outside for a bit and stood in the cold and felt old and sad in the way that only parents understand that particular grief of watching your child learn something hard that you couldn't protect them from learning. When I came back in, Priya said she needed to talk to Lachlan. She needed to know exactly what his financial situation was. Not an estimate. Not a general sense. The actual numbers. She asked me to come with her. I said, "Are you sure you want that?" She said yes. So the next evening, Saturday, the three of us sat down at their kitchen table in the flat they shared in Addington. Lachlan knew something was coming. You could see it in how still he was sitting. He'd made tea, which was something. He looked young, sitting there. 28 is young. I remembered being 28. Priya asked him, calmly and directly, to walk her through his finances. She was not angry. She was not attacking him. She was asking as a partner who needed to understand. What came out of the next 40 minutes was not what I'd been expecting. And I'd been expecting something bad. Lachlan had student loan debt, which was normal enough. But he also had $3,000 on a credit card he hadn't told her about. He had a personal loan from a finance company, $1,200, taken out 18 months ago, barely touched in terms of repayment for reasons that were initially vague, and then, with gentle pressing, turned out to be a trip to Melbourne with friends before he and Priya had started dating. He was paying the minimum on all of it. His take-home pay, after rent and these minimum repayments and his phone plan, left him with very little. He'd been covering the gap by borrowing from Priya. Priya asked him what his plan was to pay back what he owed her. He said he'd been meaning to work out a plan. She asked him when. He said he wasn't sure. It was stressful to think about. I have been a patient man for most of my 63 years. In that moment I had to work quite hard at it. I said, and I was careful about my tone, Because I wasn't there to ambush him. I was there because my daughter had asked me to be Lachlan. I'm not here to make this into a confrontation, but I think you need to understand what this situation looks like from where I'm sitting. He looked at me. I said, "My daughter has given up a trip she saved for years. She's working extra shifts. She's not doing professional development she needs and wanted. She's sitting here tonight having had her card declined at a dinner in front of her friends. All of this while you've been managing your own money the same way you were managing it before she came along. That's not a rough patch. That's a pattern." The silence in that kitchen was significant. Lachlan said, after a while, that he hadn't thought about it that way, that he'd always thought of it as temporary. I said, "Temporary has been going on for 18 months. Priya asked him something then that I thought was the bravest and most important question she could have asked. She said, "Do you actually have a plan for your life? Like, a real one? Because I've been assuming we had one together and I'm not sure you've been assuming that." He didn't answer quickly enough. I don't know what would have happened if he'd had a good answer ready. I suspect my daughter might have tried to make it work. Because she is generous and she loved him, and people in their 30s don't end relationships easily. But the pause was too long, and what he said when he finally spoke was not a plan. It was a feeling. He said he'd always figured things would sort themselves out. Things sort themselves out. $17,000. Extra Saturday shifts. No, Europe. Card declined. Priya nodded slowly. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at me, and then back at him, and she said, "I need some time to think." We left. In the car on the way back to mine, she didn't say much. I didn't either. I turned the heater up and drove. When I pulled up outside my house, she sat there for a minute, and then she said, "I paid for the Melbourne trip too, didn't I? Just not the original one." I didn't answer because she wasn't really asking me. She came in, had some toast and tea with us, and went home about 10 o'clock. The following week was quiet. She texted me a couple of times. Lachlan had apparently called her several times and wanted to talk. Wanted to show her he was serious about changing. She said she was thinking. On the Thursday, she rang me to say she'd had a long conversation with him and he'd seemed genuinely upset and genuinely motivated, and she wanted to give him a chance to show he meant it. I said, "That's your call and I'll support it." I meant that. It was her call. I also rang her back the next morning and said because I'm her father and she'd asked me into this and I owed her honesty. Just be clear with yourself about what giving him a chance looks like in the practice. What would he need to actually do, not just say, for you to know he meant it? Put that in your own head first, before you tell him. She said she would. I'm not sure how much of what followed was about the chance she gave him, and how much was about the clarity that comes from having finally looked at something directly. What I do know is that over the following 3 weeks, Lachlan did not set up a repayment plan. He did not contact a financial counselor, which she had gently suggested. He bought new shoes. She saw the bag when she was over at the flat. When she raised the repayment conversation again, he said he was still working up to it. She rang me on a Sunday afternoon, about 3 weeks after the kitchen table conversation. She said she'd ended it. She sounded tired and sad, and also, underneath that, like a person who has finally put down something heavy. She moved back into our spare room for 6 weeks, while she found a new flatmate situation. It gave me time with her that I hadn't expected to have at this stage of her life, and I won't pretend I didn't value it, even under the circumstances. She got her own place in October. She's careful with her money in a way that is different from before, more deliberate, less abstract. She's rebooked the Europe trip. She's doing the professional development course starting in March. Last month, she told me she'd started seeing someone she'd met through a friend of a friend. Early stages. He's 40. Divorced. No drama about it. 2 kids he sees every fortnight. Owns his car outright, and has never once asked her to cover anything. She laughed when she told me that last part. He actually fought me for the bill at dinner, she said. I didn't know what to do. I said, that's how it's supposed to feel. That Sunday morning phone call I mentioned at the beginning, that was from Lachlan. Not through my daughter. He'd found my number somehow, and he called me directly to tell me I'd ruined his relationship by interfering, and that I'd never given him a fair chance, and that some fathers should stay out of their children's lives. I let him finish. Then I said, I think you rang the wrong person with this call, son. You should be ringing a financial counselor. And I hung up. If there's anything I'd want anyone younger than me to take from what happened, it would be this. Patterns are more honest than promises. When someone shows you consistently how they treat money, how they treat responsibility, how they treat the gap between what they say and what they do, believe that, not the version of themselves they tell you they're working toward. Intentions are not plans. Feelings are not actions. The other thing I'd say is this. The people who love you should be making your life larger, not smaller. When you look back over a stretch of time and you find you've given up things, stopped moving toward things, quietly contracted, that's worth naming. Not with blame, but with honesty. Because sometimes the most generous thing you can do for yourself and for the other person is to name it clearly before it goes further. My daughter is 31 years old, and she has her whole life in front of her, and she's booking flights to Europe. That's what matters. The rest of it sorted itself out, as it turned out. Just not the way Lachlan had planned. I've been thinking about this a lot since everything settled down. Not obsessively, I'm too old for that, but in the quiet way you turn something over when you're stacking firewood or driving somewhere familiar. Trying to understand what actually happened and why it took as long as it did to surface. What I keep coming back to is this. Nothing in Priya's story was dramatic. There was no single moment of betrayal, no explosion, no obvious villain. Lachlan wasn't a bad person in any clear-cut sense. He was just a person who had learned, somewhere along the way, that discomfort could be deferred. That if you waited long enough and felt bad enough about it, someone who loved you would quietly absorb the gap. And Priya, because she is generous and warm and didn't want to be the kind of person who counted every dollar in a relationship, let that pattern run for nearly 2 years before a declined card at a dinner table forced the reckoning that 100 smaller moments had not. That's the part that gets me. Not the money, though. $17,000 is not nothing, and I hope she recovers every cent of it internally, even if she never sees it back in her account. It's the other costs. The Europe trip she'd been saving toward since her early 20s. Quietly shelved. The professional development course. Quietly dropped. The Saturday shifts she picked up. Quietly. Without anyone asking her to. None of those things announced themselves as losses. They just accumulated. Like water finding its way under a door. Until one day, you're standing in something cold and you're not entirely sure when it got in. I think that's what I'd want anyone watching this to sit with. Not the dramatic version of being taken advantage of, the obvious, loud version that's easy to name, but the quiet version. The version where someone isn't cruel to you. They're just consistently comfortable at your expense. Where the financial imbalance is always framed as temporary, always just about timing, always on the verge of sorting itself out. That framing is worth examining, because timing that never improves isn't timing. It's character. Priya had the courage to look at it directly once she let herself. That took intelligence, not book intelligence, but the harder kind. The willingness to see something clearly, even when seeing it means you have to act on it. And then she had the resolve to act. Which is different again. Plenty of people see clearly and still don't move. She moved. She had that uncomfortable conversation at the kitchen table. She asked the questions that needed asking, and when the answers weren't good enough, she made a decision that cost her something real in the short term in order to protect something far more valuable long term. What she's building now, her own place, the Europe flights, the course starting in March, A new person in her life who actually reaches for the bill that didn't happen despite the hard stretch. It happened because of how she came through it. You don't get that kind of clarity cheaply. She earned it. I'm 63. I've watched enough of life to know that the people who come out of difficult things with their integrity intact, with their self-respect intact, tend to be the ones who were honest when it was uncomfortable. Not cruel, not vengeful, just honest. With the other person, yes, but first and most importantly, with themselves. That's the only version of a good outcome I know. Not luck. Not things magically sorting themselves out. Just honesty. And then the hard, ordinary work of building something real on the back of it. Priya's doing that work. I couldn't be prouder of her if I tried.